I, 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 I. He got fired from Kane. Now we ain't got no shame. So we started a pod. Chuck Yates needs a job.
Hey, everybody, welcome to Chuck Yates Needs a Job, the podcast. My guest today is Brian Gitt. Brian, welcome in.
Thanks for having me, Chuck. Excited to be here.
All right, let's just jump right into it. Are you Nixon going to China, or are you Ben Solo?
Wow, deep questions to start.
Exactly. Give me your story, because this is fascinating. You're a unicorn. I didn't know this person existed.
Yeah, well, my evolution has taken place over many years. You know, I started, really all this goes back for me. The genesis was falling in love with the outdoors, actually. I used to lead wilderness trips for teenagers in Alaska, throughout the Southwest, going backpacking, mountaineering, ice climbing, all that kind of stuff. We would go in Alaska for 40 days with a group of teenagers, like 15 and 16-year-olds, and it would be 10 days from a road and just that kind of raw wilderness. And I just fell in love with the outdoors. And from that point on, I just wanted to do something to help protect that environment, protect nature. And so that's what drew me in initially, to be my interest in energy and green building and kind of that whole background in renewable energy and power. And so I just, like most things I do, I just went 100% head over heels for it, all in. I mean, I did crazy things. I worked at a permaculture farm, milking goats and growing our own food, like the true hippie commune up in Humboldt County, California.
A goat's a nasty animal, by the way. It really underrated the nastiness of goats. Not fun to tangle with.
Yeah, especially when you're waking up at like 5 a.m. to milk them and they're really, annoyed with you. But yeah, so I mean, I really went all in on this. I went to work for a general contractor because I really wanted to understand how buildings went together so I could make them more energy efficient and green. So, working in all the building trades, from electrical, plumbing, general contracting, all of that. I had a brief diversion in this kind of interesting chapter where I built a company that was designing contained composting systems. So we were composting various types of organic waste, like food waste, yard waste, all that kind of stuff. But we were doing it at the institutional and commercial level, or even a municipal level. So we would develop these systems and use earthworms, a specific species of worms. I have some horror stories I don't want to bore you with, but.
Okay. Hey, Brian, just real quick. When I woke up this morning, I looked at my calendar. Oh, I'm recording with Brian. I did not have on the bingo card that within the first 45 seconds of the podcast, we'd be talking goats and earthworms.
Yeah, see?
But keep going.
Keep it interesting, man.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a whole saga where basically our mission was to process organic waste closest to the source of generation. So we were working with municipal entities, like at landfills, at food waste processing facilities that make like the frozen dinners, confined animal feeding operations, schools. And I won't bore you with the details, but I spent 3 years working on that project and lots of growing pains from that. And then I was just immersed in this world, this sustainability, green world. And that really led me to focus on energy and buildings. And so at that point, I became executive director of this green building trade association in California that represented all of the key stakeholders promoting renewable energy, green building, energy efficiency, all of these best practices. And so one day I'd be working with Pulte Homes on production built new homes. The next day I'd be talking with a local government designing green building policy. The next day with a lender or real estate agent. And so it helped me understand and shape my viewpoint of all these different stakeholders on kind of that bold vision in California. From there, I went and worked and led a consulting company that we grew from like a 15-person little boutique shop to about 50 people. And we really took off during the Obama administration because they were flooding us with cash. So we were one of the pigs at the trough. We were eating our way all the way through it, man. It was
cilantro, how quickly we forget.
Yeah. I mean, there was billions of dollars flooding into energy to put people back to work, shovel-ready jobs. And because of my previous role at this trade association, I had a lot of relationships with local government and all these stakeholders, utilities. And so we pulled together this proposal and basically won a bunch of money, a big contract. My firm won a $60 million contract to implement, which became Energy Upgrade California, which was a statewide green building / energy efficiency program to upgrade homes and buildings and make them more efficient. From there, I went on to start a software company focused on basically how do you quantify the savings potential of solar energy in homes and energy efficiency improvements like heating, air conditioning, that kind of stuff. All the way in my most recent thing, I worked on wireless power technology. So basically sending electricity through the air using radio waves. So just like on your mobile phone, you can get data. We could send power through the air 30 feet away to power cameras, electronic devices in factories, and all these kind of cool applications. So I'll stop there, but that's just a quick snapshot of my evolution.
So that stuff's fascinating, and we could talk that stuff all day long, but kind of the question I got is what happened? Because that doesn't sound like your Twitter feed today.
No, it definitely doesn't. And my evolution happened over many years. It wasn't one landmark event. But what happened was, because I was in the belly of the beast, I was working in California on the most progressive energy programs in the country. And what I saw is that they just don't work, right? I thought the problem was, well, if we just had enough money, we could scale these things and really make the impact that we were aspiring to. The reality is they were fundamentally flawed in the design, and the core principles that we held were not true, right? And so there's two things you can do when you're wrong about something. You can just continue to plow forward and make the same mistakes, or you can have some self-reflection and kind of suck up your ego a little bit and say, man, this was just not the right investment of time and energy. And unfortunately, I wasted over 20 years of my life working on the wrong problem. I had the right instincts to work in energy, and that's this kind of the foundation of all of human flourishing and progress is derived from energy use and consumption, but I was working at it on the wrong angle. And so seeing these programs year after year fail, not be cost effective.
Define fail. Oh, you were getting there, but define fail.
A lot of the hype around a lot of the solar and energy efficiency programs is that they save money and that they deliver all this value. Well, what we found is, no, the reason you have to provide so much subsidy and so much incentive is because they actually don't deliver enough value in most situations. Now, again, in California, if you're putting solar on a large home that has a big load and you have no shade issues, sure, it makes sense. It pencils, but still, it requires tremendous rebates, tax credits, and all of these subsidies to make that happen. Same thing with energy efficiency improvements. The average improvement that we were helping to facilitate with low-cost financing and rebates and subsidies would cost, $15,000, $20,000 to upgrade the heating and air conditioning system in your home and insulation and all these basic improvements. So that would never pencil just from an economic standpoint. There's good reasons to do it. I mean, I'm pro insulation and pro efficiency, right? I mean, you have better sound acoustics, so you don't hear your neighbors or the street noise. You have better thermal comfort. You have a lot of these benefits, but you're not doing it strictly for economic reasons. You're doing it because you need to replace your air conditioner anyway, and you can take advantage of this $5,000 rebate from the government or the utility that's helping you pay for it. So I just saw all the cracks starting to show in how these programs operate, and that they were never going to scale and never hit the goals, these very aspirational, ambitious goals that the various regulators and politicians had set forth.
Wow, that might be Ben Solo. I hate to answer the question for you, but because it does feel like the discussion, and I've been an oil and gas guy kind of my whole career, so I understand the economics there. I can walk through, I can look at somebody's numbers and I can say, okay, you didn't count this, you didn't count that. When I look through solar, wind, that's what you always hear is that they're cheaper, they're more cost effective, all that. It's just big bad oil won't allow you to do it. My response has always been, big bad oil is all about money. If it were cheaper, they would do it. I mean, so how do we kind of break down? Can you get into maybe some examples, an example with like some specific numbers to figure out why this is kind of more well, why it's not as efficient as kind of claimed.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, their core, large scale wind and solar farms are expensive, wasteful add-ons to the existing power grid. And let's walk through why I'm making this claim and what is the basis for that. So the first thing to realize is these sources of energy have very low power density, which means they take up a lot of surface area, a lot of land. So to site these things, no one wants a big solar farm or a wind turbine in their backyard, obviously in the suburb of Houston. So you're going to site
or
them
off Kennebunkport in Maine, or off Martha's Vineyard. Didn't Ted Kennedy protest that? Yeah,
our most desired coastlines. No one wants to look at this stuff for a whole variety of reasons we can get into. But the bottom line is you need to site them far away from the businesses and homes that use the energy. And because you need a huge area of land, for example, a 200 megawatt wind farm would require about 13 square miles of land. So miles versus a natural gas plant is you could fit on a single city block, right? So you're talking about huge differences in amount of space. A solar farm is going to use a tremendous amount more land. For example, on the wind side, it's about 360 acres are the amount of area that it uses compared to a nuclear power plant to generate the same amount of electricity. And solar is better than that because wind has basically a power density of kind of 1 versus solar at 10. So solar is basically 10x more energy dense than wind, but it still uses a tremendous amount of land. And you have to go where the sun and wind is, right? You can't just put these things anywhere. So because of that, these large installations have to be sited far from these urban areas. Now, you have to buy all that land, first of all. Now, that's going to vary depending on the cost of real estate, depending if you're in Maine or Texas or Florida, et cetera, California. But then now you got to get that power back to the urban area. And that transmission cost is huge. So let's walk through an example. So in Southern California, there's this area, and it's called the Inland Empire. It's just east of Los Angeles area, where there's a lot of sun and a lot of wind. And so they built a bunch of solar and wind resources out there. And they built this transmission line called the Tehachapi transmission line. And they thought it was going to cost $1.7 billion. It's a 173-mile line. So 173 miles to send electrons from the wind turbine to the business or to the home. What it actually cost was $3 billion when they finished it. And this is just one transmission line. So when we're talking about this cost and scale of locating these very large facilities, we're talking about big dollars. So let's scale that up a little bit more. California has this big, bold plan. They want to be 100% renewable by 2045. Well, to do that, they're counting on investing $30 billion in new high voltage transmission capacity. So not all the local distribution, not anything about the solar panels or the wind turbines, just the high voltage transmission, $30 billion. Well, that sounds like a lot, but it's even worse than that, because the real cost to the consumer or the ratepayer, for every dollar that's invested in that transmission asset, $3.50 has to be paid over the life of the asset by the business owner, the homeowner, over the life of that transmission line. So you're talking about $100 billion in costs that someone's going to have to pay for, someone's going to have to eat, and that's going to get forced on to the ratepayer, the consumer.
So let me cut you off and
sure.
walk me again, because I may have just missed it. $30 billion is the cost of those lines. How did you get to $100 billion again? Make sure I understand that.
Sure. So there's the actual initial cost, but then there's they have to maintain and operate those over the course of the life. So let's say it's 35 years over the life of the asset.
Gotcha.
So there's additional cost involved. So they actually charge when they calculate when they create the formula to how they're going to actually recoup that investment. It's about $3.50 for every dollar invested.
Gotcha. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. So we got $100 billion into the high-speed transmission lines.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and that's before we've not actually put up a single wind turbine or solar panel yet. That's just on the transmission lines. And then all of that takes a lot of land, right? You got to have all these easements, you got to buy land and all of these things. Well, then you got to pay property tax on all that land. So that, this isn't, utilities aren't charities. This isn't just free, right? There's cost to buy the land. There's to own and maintain the land in terms of property taxes. And then after all of that, you have to have the ability to store some of this energy, because as we all know, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So what happens in California when it's cloudy out or the wind stops, et cetera? And this happens obviously a lot more than, depending on the latitude and the climate, than you would want, right?
Right.
So the amount of storage you need in terms of battery storage is just huge. And right now, battery storage is rated about 1 to 4 hours. It's mainly just used to extend kind of solar during the day for a couple hours into the early evening. It's not meant to store over the whole night or multiple days if there's bad inclement weather. And when you start talking about other areas, here's a great example of this, because the #1 leader in the world on solar and wind is Germany, right? They've invested will have invested $550 billion equivalent by 2025 in all of this solar and wind infrastructure. So to do that, and to go 100% renewable, that doesn't even get them close to 100%, but that's what they're already allocated and spending. They're going to have, if they were going to overcome all the wind droughts and gloomy days in Germany, they would have to overcome a 61-day deficit of wind and sun. So that just when, the sun's obviously, it's gloomy out, you're not going to get the full amount of radiation hitting the panels, et cetera. And they did this analysis. They went back over 35 years of data. So these aren't projections. This isn't estimates. They looked at hourly interval data over 35 years of history to find that you would need to overcome the 61-day period of kind of scarce wind and sun. So when they calculated the numbers of what that would mean in terms of energy storage, they would need 24 days of energy storage. So not a few hours, not 24 hours, 24 days to basically go to this 100% renewable scenario. That's 36 terawatt hours of energy. That's just, the cost of that is so astronomical, it's a non-starter, right? It's just, you can't do that. So that's just an example of the magnitude of the costs we're talking about when we start talking about storage costs, transmission costs, property tax, land investment. All of these things add up.
Gotcha. So, and I'll take us off the road real quick, and we'll come back. But in the response back to that, but batteries get cheaper every day. Look at Moore's law. The improvements are so great. Technology will solve this in the next decade.
Moore's law doesn't apply to battery technology or to solar and wind technology. It's a category error of thinking to apply that. Most of the costs are, sure, we're always going to incrementally get better, and batteries are getting better, and solar is incrementally getting better. But it's not Moore's law. It's not doubling every 18 months. You're looking at small incremental gains of a few percentage points a year of greater efficiency. And most of the cost reductions are now gone. We're actually seeing prices go up because of commodity inflation, because of increasing energy costs. I mean, solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries are made with a lot of energy and a lot of commodities to make these things. So there's this fallacy that these costs are going to keep dropping, where actually now you're starting to see them go back up as commodity inflation prevails. And we're likely to see, for at least the near future, foreseeable future, we're going to be in a state of commodity inflation. So these costs are not going to continue to drop. They're actually going to go up.
I've often, and I was a little bit leading the witness there. I think the reason Moore's law doesn't apply is God came down and said the amount of energy stored in oil, in a barrel of oil, weighs 300 pounds. The same amount of energy stored in lithium weighs 20,000 pounds. And that's just theoretical limits based on physics. As I like to say, that's what God declared when the earth was formed. And that's your limiting factor. I mean, it has to be. So it costs a lot of money. Let's talk a little bit about this, because I don't think people appreciate this. And I'll get these numbers wrong, so correct me. 70% of all solar is made in China. 60% of wind turbines, I think, are made in China. At the end of the day, China, 2/3 of their energy is from coal, I believe. So, in effect, creating these renewable, the solar and the wind, is really China exporting coal, isn't it? Or am I
Correct.
looking at that wrong?
No, you are looking at it with clear eyes. You know, the reality is right now, obviously what's happening with Russia and energy security and national security is becoming a top agenda item for good reason, because you can see how vulnerable countries are. I mean, Russia could not have initiated this attack without this long plan of kind of making Europe, and especially Germany and these other countries, more dependent on their oil and gas resources, right? And so all we would be doing by going to this 100% renewable fantasy is shifting to China, because the numbers are actually deceiving and they're much worse than you just stated. So about 80% of the solar panels are made in China, but when you actually start breaking down the integral components to make it, like the solar ingots and the solar wafers, the very energy intensive process to make polysilicon, it's almost 99% of those core components are made in China, because they have very weak environmental regulations and labor regulations. 45% of all the solar grade polysilicon in the world is made with slave labor in Xinjiang province. So people call it forced labor. You can call it what you want. It's slavery when you don't have a choice whether you go to work and what factory you work and how long you work, and you're not getting paid a fair wage. And that's basically, there's about over 1 million people in detention camps working in these factories that are making the solar grade polysilicon. So 45% of that, but that gets blended with all of the other polysilicon. So you don't even know, there's no real traceability for a solar panel to know, well, is my solar grade polysilicon coming from Xinjiang, or is it coming from another part of China or somewhere else? You don't really know because it's blended in. So you have slave labor, that helps decrease the cost quite a bit. And then you have basically the Chinese government that has very consciously and strategically subsidized their industry to break the back of Europe and the US manufacturing of solar panels. So in Europe, it's almost, I think it's completely gone. I'm not aware of any significant solar manufacturing in Europe anymore. The United States has dropped off a cliff. It's down to a trickle. We have a few, but almost all of the major capacity is now coming out of China. And to get around some of these tariffs and kind of forced labor issues, et cetera, what China does is has agreements with operations in Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand to assemble the panels and ship them out from there to get around tariffs and to get around some of these labor issues. So the core components, the energy intensive components that are made using cheap coal and slave labor in China are then getting assembled in Malaysia and Vietnam and then shipped over to Europe and the United States. So when we talk about energy security, this is incredibly dangerous. I mean, China is our #1 strategic adversary in the world. They're much more powerful than Russia. And to put our entire energy system in the hands of China, they could overnight decide to flip a switch and stop supplying parts, materials, panels, and all the critical infrastructure that's required, would be put us in this terrible position, obviously. So I'm very concerned about that.
So you just gave kind of some qualitative commentary around the economics, and you alluded to the actual dollars and cents, but let me get you to opine on, when you look at solar and wind and you look at the costs, if you're using construction costs from 5 years ago, coal prices have gone through the roof. So you cannot project that going forward. You alluded to this too, the components, I mean, just the precious metals, et cetera. If we're really going to do this on a big scale, we're going to have to go find more of that stuff. And I don't think that's going to get cheaper over time. So those metals are going to be more expensive. And I do believe that ultimately in the human experience, you have to be better to your people or else you get into trouble. So as much as I agree that the slave labor in China. I do think over time that has to go away. Either the people revolt or China does better on the human rights front to more integrate them into the rest of society. So thinking the cost structure from past is going to be the cost structure going forward. Now, look, I also believe technology improves over time and costs generally go down, but I have a real struggle seeing that happen. Am I right about that? Or
You are. I mean, the 50 to 70% of the cost of a wind turbine and solar panel is in these commodities and energy embodied cost. So that's, we're obviously in this inflationary environment with commodities, it's going to get more expensive, not less. So we're already seeing some of the largest wind manufacturers in the world. They're losing money on every wind turbine they sell. They're losing money. They have a negative profit margin. And so they're in real big trouble. The only reason this industry exists is it's propped up by overly generous subsidies and tax credits. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. I mean, period. Both on the Chinese side, because they've subsidized to lower the cost with not only the slave labor and cheap coal, but also the government just flooding their companies with money to drive down the cost. But also then all of the tax incentives and subsidies of the Western governments, Europe and the United States as an example. Without that, this technology doesn't have legs. It doesn't stand on its own. And if you then add in to overcome these reliability and resilience issue by really providing durable long-term battery storage, as we talked about earlier, it's just the physics and economics of this make no sense, right? It's not a smart way to design an energy system. And there's a huge opportunity cost to wasting all this money. Over the last decade or so, we've spent globally about $2.7 trillion on solar and wind installations. And all of that money and all of that time, we've moved the needle from 87% fossil fuels that is supplying the world to 84%. So we've basically decreased 3%. We've moved the needle over 10 years and this massive investment, and it's barely even a dent, and it's creating all of these additional problems and not even delivering on the result. So it's a huge problem.
so, Brian, when we look, I see this on Twitter, I see this on LinkedIn, I see various places. You always see the chart, and on the left, you have the high energy costs, and it's always oil, gas, and coal. And then it always has on the right the low cost of solar and wind. And I don't have the capability of getting in there and figuring out what they're including, what they're not including. But I hear things like, well, the wind and solar guys don't calculate decommissioning costs. That's not included in it. Do you have any color on why we see these charts, given what we've just been talking about?
It's really comparing apples and oranges, and it's an unfair comparison to begin with. So people on Twitter are talking about different things, and I don't want to group them all in one. Some people, when they're talking about the cost of the panels, they'll say, oh, look, the cost of the solar panels has gone down 80% over the last decade. Well, that's true. It has, for a lot of the reasons we talked about earlier. But that's not necessarily the full cost of energy. And then there's other people on Twitter or other people citing reports. They're talking about the levelized cost of energy, which does include land costs and does include financing costs, et cetera. So you need to parse that, first of all. What are they talking about, the wind turbine in the panel, or are they talking about the actual cost of energy itself? But the reason why it's apples and oranges is because you're comparing completely different products. Like if I was going to sell you a car and I said, okay, car number one over here, you can drive it 6 to 8 hours a day, but no more. And you can only drive it during this time. So you can drive it from, 9 a.m. to, let's say, 4 or 5 p.m. period. You can't drive at night, can't pick up, go to dinner in it or on, other times. And then the car two, you can drive whenever you want. It's 24/7, et cetera. Are those cars valued the same? Of course not. I mean, they're providing different value. And so it's this intermittency issue that is not being truly factored in when you look at those numbers. And the reality is, anytime you see a solar and wind farm, it's additional. It's not replacement. Germany is the best example of this because they've spent, as I alluded to earlier, more money, this $550 billion investment. They went from 11% solar and wind on the grid to 40%, right, since the year 2000. So they've done more than anyone on the planet on this. But when you look at their fossil fire generation, they still have 90% of the fossil fire generation that they had 20 years ago. So you're not actually, even though they increased this, they spent massive amount of money, increased all this capacity, they're not actually shutting off various natural gas and coal power plants to be replaced by that. So that's the fundamental misconception that most people have, is they think this is just, it's an apples or orange, that they're comparing two similar things when they're not. They're completely different. And no matter how much wind and solar you put on the grid, you're still going to have consistent, reliable baseload power. Otherwise, you're going to have outages. And that's what we're starting to see in parts in Texas and California, where you're having large amounts of intermittent renewables added, because it's not just that you have all these additional costs. It's actually parasitic. They're like parasites on the grid, because they're eroding the economics of running a natural gas power plant or a coal power plant. So instead of running the coal plant or the natural gas plant, let's say at 65% of the time, now you're running it, let's say 30% of the time or 40% of the time. So obviously the economics of running that plant degrade, right? All these policies give this preferential treatment to these solar and wind resources and cannibalize the economics of the durable baseload power. So it has this unfortunate effect of making our stable resources less cost effective and adding more cost to the grid as it is. So do you see how they're really not apples and apples as a comparison?
So have you seen a good resource that tries to summarize and put it on an apples to apples basis? Because I don't think I've seen one.
Well, the one Twitter thread I put out that was all about the levelized cost of energy, I did a thread on this. And this is even the criticism of that thread is, well, you're comparing existing power plants to new solar and wind farms, right? But that is the reality most times that we're looking at. We're not looking at kind of building from scratch in a greenfield development. Do we build a new coal plant or do we build a new solar farm? Right? We're talking about either extending the life or upgrading existing infrastructure or augmenting it and adding these additional solar and wind resources. So it's really not even a reasonable comparison, because if you build that solar farm, you still need to operate a natural gas plant, the pipelines, all the maintenance, all the infrastructure that's needed to operate that natural gas plant still has to be there. So you don't get rid of it. So it's really, you can't just do this very clean, easy comparison of, well, if I build a new natural gas plant and I build a new solar farm, because when you build a solar farm, you need both. You need the natural gas plant and the solar farm. You don't get rid of that.
Yeah. So if I were going to oversimplify the apples to apples comparison, and I haven't done it, but I do need to go do that. I think it would be helpful, is solar renewables don't include decommissioning costs, and they don't include battery backup to deal with your reliability issue. I don't know how I would handle this on the oil and gas side, but I do think it's fair. CO2 does have a cost, and it's probably not being captured somehow. So there probably is something fair to do on that side in terms of at least quantifying it, because that's really what we're talking about, I think, to get it to apples to apples.
You mentioned the decommissioning, and this is actually a huge looming problem for the solar industry and wind industry, because it's basically in danger of sinking under its own waste. So solar panels, most of the estimates that a lot of the academic papers and this analysis that has been done are estimating that solar panels last about 30 years. But that's not often the case. I mean, maybe in certain situations and ideal conditions, that's the case, but we see all the time where solar panels get replaced after 10 years, 15 years. And as the economics have changed, any smart consumer would upgrade their panels anyway, well before the end of their useful life. It makes sense, like in California, if you bought a solar system on your house in, let's say, 2011, by right about now, it makes sense to actually upgrade the panels in the system based upon the unit economics of the upgrade. So what's going to happen when you start prematurely retiring all of these panels that they thought were going to last for 30 years, but are only lasting 10 years or 15 years are really at the most about 20 years is what we're looking at. But it's somewhere in that range, right? Very few of these systems are really going to be operational and functioning at high productivity for 30 years. So you have just this massive amount of waste that has to be dealt with. In recycling, people say, well, we're going to recycle them. Well, recycling is incredibly expensive. These are huge, big, bulky things to dispose of, and they have a lot of toxic, hazardous waste in them. So oftentimes, local governments classify solar panels as hazardous waste, which means they have to be handled and shipped in a very specific way. And they break easily, so the heavy metals can leach into groundwater and the landfills, all this kind of stuff. And so it's a huge problem. They're estimating that there'll be 78 million tons of solar panel waste by 2050, which, just to kind of make that clear, it's about 60 million Honda cars. So imagine a Honda car, like 60 million of those worth of solar panels are going to be thrown away. So these things don't last that long. Let's just be generous and say about 20 years or so, plus or minus. There's all kinds of other issues that happen for underperformance of these panels. I was talking with a friend of mine that used to work for SunPower, probably the highest quality photovoltaic dealer out there that makes these panels. And they have huge amount of inverter failures, all kinds of workmanship issues, the modeling on the shading. So a lot of these systems are underperforming, especially on the residential level. And so they're not delivering the CO2 reduction and the savings that is promised anyway, due to a lot of these underperforming systems. And the fact that they're not going to last for 30 years, many of these systems are going to be trashed and aren't going to be recycled because it costs like $20 to $30 to recycle one panel versus shipping it to a landfill is like $1 or $2. So what are you going to do unless you're required to? And if you're required to, that's going to be passed on to the homeowner or to the business, right? And that's just going to escalate the cost, and it's going to break the whole economics of doing it in the first place.
Because when we do that apples and apples comparison, if I'm taking the solar and wind side of it, it's, yeah, you pay a lot up front for these things, but then they quote unquote run for free, even though they don't run for free, but the operating cost is relatively low. The flip side of that is 30 years is one thing, 15 years is totally different. I mean,
right.
That's the amortization. So,
a great side story on this issue of solar panels not needing maintenance. So Greenpeace decided to create a solar village in India in 2014. And so they came in there and they subsidized and funded this solar array in this village that didn't have electricity at the time, which is great, right? I mean, solar is a wonderful technology for rural applications where you don't have existing power lines. After 3 years, the system stopped working and they weren't able to maintain it. And today it's like a cow shed. So it's basically not being utilized. And that village is hooked up now, finally, after this since 2014, is hooked up to the electricity grid, and they're using coal power. So that program and that installation lasted just a few years. I mean, these things, it's not like you set it and forget it. There are maintenance issues required. The inverters fail, workmanship issues, the panels need to be cleaned. There's all kinds of things that degrade performance and need to be looked after.
So if we think through this, CO2 parts per million have gone from 300 parts per million to, call it, 425 parts per million today. Let's call that over the last 125 years. Temperature has risen 1.5 degrees in that time. Correlation does not mean causation, but my position on this is we ignore that at our own peril. I mean, I don't think it's proven science that you can pound the table and say we're causing this, but the eyeball test says we probably are. What's the solution to this? And you're in a great position because you've kind of seen it all, if you will. What's our solution? I did this on a podcast about 3 weeks ago, the energy policy draft, where the premise was, you're the energy czar of the world. What do you do? So Brian, you're in charge. We all do what you say. What's the solution to this?
So the short, quick answer from a technology standpoint is nuclear and natural gas. Natural gas has 50% of the CO2 emissions and 10% of the air pollutants of a coal plant. The world still is dominated by coal. Toby Rice of UQT did this great presentation showing how American-made liquefied natural gas can reduce global emissions by helping facilitate this transition. So I think that's going to be absolutely necessary in terms of the natural evolution. And then nuclear power is inevitable. It's had its setbacks. There's so much misunderstanding and fear about nuclear, totally unfounded. But those are the technologies that are going to get us there. And I believe barring the edge cases and exceptions, obviously in rural areas and, in a village or something like that, where solar can be perfectly appropriate, every solar panel we're putting for an industrial application in these large facilities and every wind turbine is a step backwards to meeting these goals. Zooming out though, before we just talk just about CO2 and carbon, I think we've lost the thread a little bit about what are we trying to do? What is our goal? Like the goal is to protect and improve human lives and to protect and improve our environment. That should be the goal. Somehow this whole discussion has been essentially focused on this one attribute that leads to that outcome. So I think we have to zoom out. We have to look at, okay, given this is the goal, what are the metrics that we should be looking at? If we can give, I think most of us would agree that that is a valuable goal, right? Overall. So if that's the goal, to have a goal, you need to know if you're making it or not. You need to have a metric, right? So I think we need to look at, well, what are the core metrics around human flourishing? These are things like lifespan, economic productivity, health impacts, sanitation, water quality, habitat protection. All of we can quantify these things in very tangible metrics. Then we have to think about, well, what is going to be most effective for us to hit these metrics and do the most good for the least amount of resources? Because the other thing most of us can agree on is it's not like we have an unlimited amount of resources, right? The world has lots of problems. We have tremendous poverty. We have horrible pollution in some places. We have all kinds of disease problems. You can't just have this endless supply of money. So we have to be thoughtful and practical about how we deploy solutions and how we use these resources. So if that's the case, I personally believe that this multi-trillion-dollar investment in solar and wind is taking us away from meeting our CO2 reduction goals, right? Because it's an opportunity cost. I think if we could do three things, we could solve this problem. One is have people understand how the energy system works, at least at a high level. So there's this great book called How the World Works. It's a new book by Vaclav Smil, who's a very science kind of detailed technical guy, but this book is a much more layperson's book, and he just walks you through how energy works, how agriculture works, how steel, all these things. But we need to educate people about the basic fundamentals of how these systems work. The second is people need to understand opportunity cost, right? Because all of these dollars flooding into solar and wind are dollars not going into nuclear power, not going into new efficient natural gas plants. They're taking us away from the goal of reducing CO2. And then the third is understanding second order effects, right? Because all of these systems that we're installing have massive second order effects that most people aren't even thinking about. Like most people think when they buy a solar panel, they're not supporting slavery, right? They're not thinking they're buying when they're supporting a solar farm, that they're cutting down a forest or taking over, pristine desert that had, endangered turtles on it. I mean, there's all of these
the blunt-nosed leopard lizard. It's a long story. I'll tell you over a beer sometime, but I'll just say this. The reason the blunt-nosed leopard lizard is almost extinct is because it is the single dumbest creature God has ever put on the face of this earth. But anyway, need I digress?
So all of this comes down to one issue, I think, and that is storytelling. That is what we need is more. We have the technologies. These exist. We've had them for years. I mean, they're getting better all the time. But we have a narrative that's circulating and to the general public and has been adopted and is kind of bored into the minds of so many people that fossil fuels are bad, that nuclear is dangerous, then natural gas is leading us in the wrong direction, and that solar, wind, and electric vehicles are the panacea. These are going to get us to the promised land, and anything else is a diversion from meeting our goals. And we've lost the narrative. I understand. I used to believe that narrative. I invested 20 years of my life on that narrative. So I understand it. I'm not trying to vilify any person, or I don't attack people, but we have to actually reframe the conversation and tell better stories. And my critique of the oil and gas industry would be, you have incredibly smart, talented scientists, geologists, and technical engineers, and they've had their head down doing amazing work, providing this energy that all of us benefit from and helping us flourish. But they've done a terrible job of telling the story about it. And so they've ceded the ground to the competition, and the competition is just walloping them, right? I mean, go ask your average person on the street today, are fossil fuels good or bad? Most people, I think, maybe with the exception of certain areas in Houston, are going to say, yeah, fossil fuels are bad and they pollute too much and et cetera, et cetera.
My three kids would say that. And they've had the greatest life on the planet because of fossil fuels.
They're ignoring all the benefits. It's not looking at the trade-offs. It's not looking at an honest kind of cost-benefit analysis. Because if you do, you would see very quickly that fossil fuels have been the greatest gift to human flourishing, that more than anything. 3 billion people.
Fire and wheel. I mean, we're fossil fuels, fire, wheel. That's 1, 2, 3 in some way, shape, or form. Maybe throw in antibiotics.
Yeah, and so we have to change that story. People think, even like a simple example, I was reading this morning about the embodied energy in chicken versus tomatoes. Like, you have all these vegetarian and vegans saying, "Oh, save the climate, go vegan, eat vegetarian." But the embodied diesel fuel in a tomato is more than a chicken. So, if you're going to talk about CO2 emissions, now obviously some cow and red meat, et cetera, has higher emission, but they're not always using that kind of nuanced thinking to really weigh these costs and benefits. And so we have to reframe the narrative. We have to tell a better story, and not always be on the defensive. Here's a couple examples on the positive side, what the industry has done. I think, in 2020, when Innovex Downhole Solutions wanted to make a co-branded jacket to give as Christmas gifts to their staff with North Face, I'm sure you're aware of this, they basically said no, and it became this whole thing. And the industry got together. They put this great campaign with the billboards, thank you North Face for the puffer jackets, and that all their products are made from oil and gas. And then Chris Wright of Liberty made this fantastic video that went semi-viral and educating people about the essential role fossil fuels play in sustaining almost everything in your life, from your phone and computer to your lights to everything. And we need more of that. Toby Rice did it just recently with his Unleashing LNG to help the transition from coal to natural gas and turning the villain into a hero, right? We need to flip that. He's basically presenting US LNG as the hero in the story and helping us achieve these goals more effectively. So we need more storytelling like that, but we can't just always be reactive. We can't wait for North Face or for everyone to basically try to make the industry go extinct or push them overseas before you come up with a compelling narrative. We have to come up proactively to tell this story in a much more effective way.
So my soapbox is exactly what you're talking about. One, I think we've historically been, as you said, run by a bunch of engineers, and engineers can't tell stories. No offense to the engineers in the audience. Two, an interesting, I think, underappreciated dynamic is if you produced oil and gas, you're a price taker, right? The world sets oil prices, the market sets it. You are not Adidas saying, hey, here's why we're better than Nike. So there's never been a culture of sales, marketing, my product's better, I need to make the case, I need to make the narrative, I need to educate it. I've got a barrel, what's the price? 70? Great, I'll take it. So I think those are two big issues. I think another big issue that I've come to learn over time, because folks will reach out through Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever, and just say, hey, Chuck, can we talk? They're from the other side, if you will. And they'll say, hey, we can't even tell people that we're talking to you, but we just want to pick your brain. And what I have found is the other side, the environmentalist side, a lot of the reason they act the way they act towards us is not because burning a hydrocarbon is a problem. I have one who's become a pretty good friend. she says, man, I could not live without my Suburban to cart my 6 kids around. It's that they don't trust us as actors. And quite frankly, I agree with them. The oil and gas business, we've hid things. We haven't been the best in terms of corporate citizens. We've gotten a lot better. But I do think it's that trust element, because this comes into my last point on the soapbox, and you're sitting there cringing. Why did I bring this up? But the last thing on the soapbox is, if you go look at psychological studies of how you change someone's mind, not an open mind, have a discussion, but someone has a held belief, and we are, as you say, at the held belief, hydrocarbons are bad today by the vast population. There are only really 3 ways you can change somebody's mind. 1, you can ask them questions. That's why the Socratic method is actually a good method of teaching. Very hard to do in a broad-based marketing type campaign, but just asking questions. 2, you can make them laugh. I have a held belief that young kids today are more liberal than normal young kids because of Jon Stewart. I mean, I watched The Daily Show every night. I thought he was hysterical, even though I didn't agree with a lot of his politics. But I'd go, okay, if John actually cares that much about it, I ought to think about it. And then the third thing is, and this is what the environmentalists have done because they don't trust us as actors, third thing you can do is scare people. And they've definitely used the scare tactics. The world's going to end in 10 years. We're all going to die. That, I know I'm somewhat unfairly categorizing the message, but that's been the underlying tone. And so I think as we try to sit here and tell these stories, and I've killed a lot of brain cells on this, and I don't have the perfect answer for this, but definitely need to educate just so people understand the trade-offs they're making. But we've also got to do it outside the echo chamber, because we sit around in energy, and anything that we think of as advocacy is great. We high five each other, but you get out into the real world and it's like, wow, it doesn't land a blow. It didn't change anyone's mind. What we use humor on is we're making fun of people because their lights went off. Well, that's not changing their hearts and minds. And so I appreciate you saying all the stuff you've done, as well as all your advocacy on Twitter, because you're right. If we don't recapture the narrative, people dying today because they don't have cheap energy, I don't know why those deaths are somehow less important than 75 years from now, people dying because of climate change.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there. I think we need to tap into people's desire to have a sense of purpose and meaning, because a lot of the people on the left side of the spectrum, an environmentalist mindset, me used to be one of them. So I really understand this, and I have a lot of friends and colleagues that think this way. So I understand the mindset is that for the most part, obviously there's some bad actors out there, but for the most part, it's coming from a desire to do good in the world, to make things better. They're wanting a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. And so they're grabbing onto it, especially as religion has kind of waned in the culture and a lot of people don't have a foundational set of values. A lot of people have gravitated, myself included, to environmentalism almost as religious replacement. And the reason why is because people are wanting a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning. And so they're deriving that from these beliefs and through these activities and actions. So when you confront someone with facts that goes against their identity, that's a hard thing to do, because they can't just admit I was wrong about that fact. They have to potentially evaluate their entire identity and how they
I've
perceive
never
them.
been able to do it.
So it's very challenging. And I went through this myself because I had a lot of invested, 20 years of my life or more as having these beliefs and seeing myself in a certain way. And it's very painful. And you also become, you lose friends, you lose kind of respect from certain people that you used to know because they view you differently. So it's a much bigger problem than just, oh, well, here's the fact, lay it out. I mean, we know this in basic marketing, right? When Nike wants to advertise their apparel gear or tennis racket or whatever, they don't bombard you with facts and say, look how many athletes use Nike shirts and how many tennis players use Nike rackets and hats. They tell you a story. They talk about Serena Williams or these famous players that basically came from nothing and against all odds, and this hero story, right? And they sell it on emotion. That's how they're effectively sold. That's how Apple computers are. You don't buy Apple computer because technically it's the best computer. Oh, I'm sure some of your listeners will argue about that. You buy Apple because you're buying into the brand. It's an emotional buy. You're buying
Steve Jobs was cool.
Yeah,
I mean, let's just cut to the chase. Yeah.
But it's an emotional decision. It's about an identity. I'm the kind of person that has an iPhone or has a Mac. And it's more than just a business financial decision to buy that laptop versus this one. So that's what we need to tap into, because natural gas, oil, nuclear, there's a great story here, because these people, they want to do good in the world. They want to make it better. So we can channel that energy and show them how they can have a much more effective outcome and impact by using these technologies properly. And you're right, the industry also has to clean up its act, things of methane emissions, et cetera. It has to be vigilant. It can't take things for granted. But if the industry steps up and implements best practices, I think there's a strong case that can be made to these people that say, hey, we have this common goal. Again, zooming out, what do we want? Improving people's lives, improving the environment. Here's a path to get there most effectively. And here's the data that supports it. But here's the emotional story that helps you make that leap and make that transition. And right now, it's all vitriol and it's this hero-villain contrast. We need to swap it, because in my mind, oil and gas are the heroes of this story, but there's been painted as the villain. So it's time to switch that around. And it can be done through effective storytelling.
I like it. So, Brian, just so you know, the energy policy draft, natural gas went number 1 and nuclear went number 2 in the draft. So great minds think alike. One funny story from that podcast, David Ramsden Wood by any chance?
Yeah, I was on his podcast, actually.
Okay, so DRW. DRW drafted, I think, second to last. He was drafting number 6, and he drafted coal. And he said, there's limited resources in the world, and I'm going to be the only one that's warm at the end of the day. So I'm taking coal. And the other point he made was, if I were running Canada right now, I'd put a coal plant on every block, because I want global warming, because with 5 degrees increase in temperature, Canada would be bearable. So not necessarily an effective storytelling on the emotion to create meaning, but he did have some real points in terms of what you said, is just the human condition and the power that energy has to deliver that. So
in coal, I mean, as much as it's often vilified, has a good story as well. I mean, look at India, look at in China. It's an amazing story of poverty reduction, right? We've gone from, in 1980, we had globally 42% people living in extreme poverty to, in a very short period of time, to about 2020, that number is less than 10%. And that was mostly due to coal and other fossil fuels helping to elevate that prosperity and solve a lot of these critical issues. I mean, about 10 million people die every year due to energy poverty, right? Of all the various types, whether it's, breathing in the wood smoke, and, that's a few million people, and all the health impacts and water sanitation. When you add it all up, it's about 10 million people a year, right? That's a lot of people every year. And coal actually is helping in that transition. So there's a good, India is like 75% coal. We're not going to get rid of coal tomorrow. I mean, Western developed, wealthier countries should transition to cleaner being fuels like nuclear and natural gas, but it's unrealistic and actually immoral, I would say, to be forcing the developing world, like in parts of India and China and other developing countries, to move, basically you're subjecting them to energy poverty. And we're seeing this, the World Bank, the European Investment Bank is divesting from thermal fossil fuel fired financing for power plants in Africa and other places. And to me, that is completely immoral, right? You are subjecting these people to energy poverty and a much less quality of life and all the health and other implications that come across that, so that you can virtue signal and feel good. We can transition, but this is going to take, many decades, not a single decade. And certainly, it's going to be way beyond 2050 overall. But we have to have a sober, thoughtful nuanced approach. Otherwise, we're going to cause a terrible amount of suffering on the poorest among us. And we can't do that.
And I know China is our enemy. It is a fair point for China to say, you got your standard of living off the back of coal. Why don't we get our shot at it? And my Marshall Plan of energy has always been, if we really wanted to be serious about this, the United States will drag our younger brother Europe into the conversation just because they don't feel left out. Needs to sit down with China and India and say, okay, guys, no more coal plants going forward. We will finance natural gas infrastructure for you guys. And, because I think it is a fair point for China and India to say that.
Yeah. However, though, China will never do that because they would be putting their energy security and their national security in peril. They would be then beholden, just like, where you're looking in Germany is to Russia right now. China would never, they have massive coal resources. They don't have a lot of natural gas resources, and they're not going to put their future and their energy security in the hands of the United States. Yeah. So that's not going to be a viable solution for getting them off coal. The viable solution is, as fast as you can ramp their economic prosperity, they're going to start being cleaner, using more emission control technologies, controlling their air pollution. We've seen it in every country that's gone through this. And so to give you an idea of the scale of this, in the last 12 months, the amount of additional coal that the world has burnt due to a lot of conflicting, converging things with the war in Ukraine, the supply shocks and spiking of natural gas, et cetera, we've burned 500 million additional tons of coal in the last 12 months. That wipes out 100% of all the wind and solar installed for the last 15 years in the United States from an emissions profile perspective. So what we've just done in 1 year with just this bump has wiped out all that investment. So that's what we're talking about. Like, we're not going to be able to build wind and solar to get out of this quandary. India and China are the main players in this if you're going to do anything about CO2 emissions and global warming. And there's no way they're going to go to natural gas when they have all these coal resources for the reasons we just said. So the best thing we can do is how they can accelerate their economic growth, because they'll naturally evolve, just like we did, just like Europe did, to cleaner burning fuels over time. And anyone that that's why China's not agreeing to these commitments until like 2060 or 2070. These politicians are going to be dead by the time this happens.
She's like, how much longer do I have? Give me 5 extra years. We'll agree to that. Yeah.
That's my real criticism. All these climate pledges, and this goes for most politicians, maybe not all, but most, it's just a bunch of crap, right? I mean, they're putting out these 2050 pledges. They're not going to, there's no accountability for this. They're not going to be around, much less well before that. So it's great because it sounds great and you get votes and makes people excited. And they're just wanting to keep control and stay in office. And so these you're already seeing right after the COP26 conference, Japan, that committed at the conference, then is backing out, and their fossil fuel consumption is now plans to go up. So I give zero weight to these climate pledges. And honestly, most of the countries don't matter anyway, because it's really just about these really core growing economies in Asia, specifically China and India, that make any difference. The rest of us it's in the noise. It's not going to move the needle at all. If we stopped 100% of the CO2 emissions in the US and Europe, is going to be so minor in impact and the temperature that it might not even be measurable, right? It's going to be totally inconsequential based upon the ramp that's happening.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a peeing and a non-peeing section of the swimming pool. It's when the 5-year-olds jump in, we just get it. So yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Brian, you were really cool to come on. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to chat.
Absolutely. Nice to meet you. And, anytime you want to leave California, Texas will have you.
Well, I'm looking forward to visiting soon, hopefully. So I'll let you know when I'm coming in town.
Cool. We cover everything you think you want to cover?
Yeah, okay, we talked about a lot of stuff. And I found myself, I was rambling a little bit, a few sections there. Hopefully I wasn't going on too long. I caught myself a couple of times like, oh, I should pause here. Let Chuck say something.
It's all good. The more and more I've done this, I've kind of figured out the better content is where the guest is saying the unique stuff they know that nobody else knows. Like if you and I were sitting here talking about the Dallas Cowboy draft, nobody would really give a shit because I don't know you, but I don't have any unique insight into the Dallas Cowboy draft. That being said, all the stuff you were talking about, you uniquely know that, and so listeners will find that interesting.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah. So one question, when have you dropped podcasts? Because one of the things I've kind of seen over time is if you're on a bunch of podcasts in, a short period, a lot of times they get fewer downloads. When was the last time you did one? And
there's been a little gap, so I don't think that's going to be an issue. I did DRW, but that was like that would be a crossover audience, but that was well over 6-8 weeks ago even.
Okay.
So that's not going to conflict. I did a nuclear podcast that was probably about 3 to 4 weeks ago, but again, I think the audience is different. So I don't think there's going to be any direct conflict with your audience.
And I was saying that more for your benefit to make sure it got heard, that you got heard as opposed to mine. The last thing I'll tell you, and I didn't work this in just because it didn't fit, but have you heard what Joe Rogan said about nuclear power? Have you heard his whole bit? So his whole shtick is, and because Colin and I have said on the podcast multiple times, if we invented nuclear power yesterday, we would have the solution. Everybody would just be, oh, great, we've solved it. Let's move forward. Joe Rogan's take on that is, hey, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, the place in Japan, when were all these things built? Early 70s, right?
Yeah.
He goes, did you ever drive a car from the 70s? They sucked. We just couldn't manufacture anything back then. It's not nuclear that's the problem. It's the 70s. We sucked in the 70s. Right. Don't hold that against nuclear.
Yeah, and even those, obviously Chernobyl was all those accidents were significant, but Chernobyl being the most in the technology they were used, they didn't have any of the containment practices in dome that they have today. And the other ones, it's often glossed over. Like no one died in 3 Mile Island.
Right.
No one. Yeah. Right. There was one person that died from radiation exposure in Fukushima. One. Right. Yeah. Most people, there were deaths, but it was about the evacuation from basically the earthquake, the typhoon, et cetera. Chernobyl was about 200 people that they're estimating, including not just the first responders and the firefighters, but in the thyroid cancer. But thyroid cancer is not, it's terrible. You never want anyone to have thyroid cancer, but it's a very small percentage of those people are going to have any lasting consequences. So it's really unfortunate narrative.
Yeah, no, it's so part of Winter Storm Uri that almost shut down the grid in Texas. A nuclear plant went down. That was one of the dominoes that was falling. And it went down because a sensor broke that monitored the water temperature. And I don't know if this story is true, but I really do hope it's true. They were saying, okay, we can't monitor the water temperature. We need to shut down. That's the regulation. And there was an engineer sitting there with his hand in the tank going, it's pretty freaking cold, guys. I'll tell you when it heats up. Why are we shutting down during the biggest demand for power we've ever seen? It's fine. I'll just sit here. I'll change hands periodically. And when it warms up, I'll let you know. So
yeah, sometimes we just overlook common sense,
We really do. Well, nice to meet you, and love to get you to Houston some point. Come hang out with us.
That would be great. I certainly will let you know next time I head that way.